George Lucas sold Lucasfilm for over $4 billion back in 2012, however there's a rumour going around that he could buy it back from Disney. Strap yourselves in because we need to understand the real reasons he sold it in the first place to then understand how likely a return would be.
I will not let this just die right here.
Just a heads up, the story of how George came to sell Star Wars isn't a pretty one to tell.
They decided they didn't want to use those stories. They decided they were going to go do their own thing.
We'll kick things off with looking at how George came to sell Star Wars in the first place, how likely it is he would buy it back, and what would happen to the Disney Star Wars projects if he did return. Now this seemingly shows the moment that George Lucas signed over Lucasfilm to Disney and completed the sale, and it's followed by an interview with George Lucas revealing that they do have plans for episodes 7, 8 and 9, which will be the end of the Skywalker saga, and these are the plans that he wrote and then Disney brought from him. But also they were planned for other movies, books and characters that could pretty much last Star Wars for the next 100 years. And he also mentions the fact that he needed to retire sooner rather than later. But what George says here is only part of the picture. We need to take into account any bad blood that now resides between George and Disney, as well as where he's at in his life right now. If he wanted to retire over a decade ago, would he really want to come out of retirement now? Now, whilst fans haven't enjoyed all the content that Disney have put out with Star Wars since they took it over, there are some that they definitely have, with Rogue One often coming in higher on people's favourite Star Wars movie lists than even some movies that George himself made. And then we've got the TV shows as well, which are on Disney Plus, like The Mandalorian, Andor, as well as Obi-Wan Kenobi, which actually broke Disney Plus streaming records, which I think the Ahsoka series in the summer will look to surpass. But none of these projects were in the pipeline back in the 70s when George founded Lucasfilm and went on to create Star Wars, which was originally titled, if you didn't know, The Adventures of Luke Starkiller, as taken from the Journal of the Wilds. It's a bit of a mouthful. Now, Star Wars was originally turned down by various different studios before it actually went to Fox, and it went on to be a huge success. I don't need to tell you guys how successful Star Wars was. It's probably influenced most of your childhoods. But the success of the original trilogy then spawned the story of Darth Vader, and that just went on to inspire a new generation of kids in the 90s. However, that didn't all go swimmingly, with choices that George made with the prequels leading to the bullying of actors such as Jake Lloyd, who played Anakin in The Phantom Menace, and Ahmed Best, who played Jar Jar Binks, as well as having a lot of hate directed his own way as well. It's very much a case of fans that like the original trilogy not really liking the trilogy that followed, and that is still something we're seeing in Star Wars today with the sequels. Now, at the end of the prequel run, George brought on a young, talented animation director named Dave Filoni to help build the animation side of things, working closely alongside George on the Clone Wars. And it was this project that introduced certain characters that are now coming into live action in the Disney Plus shows. Now, as the years go by, George begins planning his version of the sequel trilogy, realising the company was losing money, and with about 2,000 people working for him, he had their best interests at heart. And he realised at this point as well, he wasn't getting any younger. He recently had a daughter, so he did need to retire at some point, and the sequels would take around 10 years to do properly. So he's kind of split at the moment between wanting to make this sequel trilogy for the company, for the staff, but also wanting to spend time with his family and do other things outside of filmmaking, such as building a museum, although he does mention he would have been making small films for his friends to watch. Now, initially he thought about handing over the production of the sequel trilogy to other directors, similar to what Disney did with the sequels, though he remembered back to a time when he was working on the original trilogy still. He directed A New Hope, but episode 5 and 6 had different directors. But George couldn't really step away from it. He found himself still micromanaging the whole process, so it wasn't really retiring. Now, during 2011, George Lucas and Bob Iger had a meeting where it was revealed that George was planning to retire and that he had already had writers in working on the sequel trilogy, and Bob Iger was very much putting his interest forwards in Disney buying Lucasfilm at that moment as well. And later on that year, George told Iger that he would consider selling him Lucasfilm, but wanted his sequel stories to be used. Now, moving to June 2012, and George Lucas hires Kathleen Kennedy as his successor and co-chair of Lucasfilm, the person who's really going to take up the mantle when he does step away. And it's in this same month that he goes and has another meeting with Iger and tells him that he's now ready to sell Lucasfilm. Now, Disney goes on to buy Lucasfilm and George's sequel treatments, but they're not obliged to use them, although it seems that George was left with the impression that they would actually be used. And that left him feeling betrayed and disappointed by Iger and the creative team involved in the whole process as well. And it turns out he actually disliked episode 7, The Force Awakens, as it lacked originality and innovation, two aspects that George probably would have focused on in his version of the sequels. Essentially, The Force Awakens was a retelling of A New Hope, and as many of us know, George always wanted to push the boundaries on what's possible when making movies. However, Episode 7 goes back to the style of the original trilogy, which of course was done in the 70s. So the total amount that Lucasfilm was sold for was said to be about 4.1 billion, and George received half of it in cash, so say around 2 billion, and the rest went in stocks. And it's at this moment that he gave up all creative rights, but he did become the second largest non-institutional holder of Disney stock, just behind the Steve Jobs estate. Now, I've had a look, and I will say I'm no expert at all, but the Disney stock is now double what it was in 2012. So if George was paid 2 billion in stocks, that's easily worth 4 billion now, regardless on how well or how poorly Star Wars has been performing. And the latest Forbes estimate has his net worth down at 5.1 billion. Now, it is worth noting that George did donate a lot of money and a lot of the proceeds from the sale to charity. So although George didn't like Episode 7, he still attended the premiere, he attended the solo premiere and potentially some more as well, and he has been on set pretty recently for Star Wars in The Mandalorian. Although largely outside of that, he's had a few interviews, but not really much has happened with George in the public eye over the years, apart from this.
They're dissolving this thing in a molten salt, and they're doing electrochemistry on it. Why don't they call it molten salt?
One thing he has been focusing on during his time away from Star Wars is the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, which was meant to open in 2022, but it's been delayed due to COVID, and it's now set to open in 2025. So he's still got that to look forward to in the near future as well. Now, a lot of fans always speculate what would have happened if George never sold Star Wars to Disney, and honestly, this is my take on it. I think the Clone Wars would have still took place. I think Rebels would have been made as well. And remember, George had a choice to make, so if he did keep Lucasfilm, it would have meant he would have made the sequel trilogy. But I doubt he'd make much live action beyond that. He likely would have released Episode 7 in 2015 or 2016, and then a movie every 3 years after that. But it means we probably wouldn't have got The Mandalorian, the Kenobi series, Boba Fett, the Ahsoka series, and all the others they're making as well. But if George did buy it back, this is the interesting part. Would he decanonize Disney Star Wars, or would he keep it due to the work that his close friend Dave Filoni has done and Rogue One, which he really liked? In terms of Kathleen Kennedy, the person that he chose to succeed him at Lucasfilm, he trusted her, he believed in her, and to be honest, if you listen to her interviews, whenever she talks about George on a rare occasion, she talks about him in the past tense like he's passed away. And if the rumours regarding Kathleen Kennedy are true, then she's already firmly on the Disney chopping board anyway, but if George did return and brought Lucasfilm, he'd almost certainly make her one of the first ones out the door. I believe the sequels would go in the Star Wars canon. I think the Solo movie would go, but I do think he would keep Rogue One, and I think he would keep Andor, as they tie in well with A New Hope, and he liked both of them projects. I believe the Kenobi series would go, and I don't know what George's thoughts are on the Kenobi series, but I can't imagine it was a story he wanted to tell. But I do think the Book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian up to Season 2 would remain, and I think the Ahsoka series would remain. I do think Mando Season 3 could possibly end up going due to all the sequel tie-ins in there, and I'd imagine he would put Dave Filoni in an elevated position. I mean, he's already got one anyway at Lucasfilm, but in this new structure with George back, he'd probably get even more control. It's someone he trusts, it's someone who he's worked alongside for a long time, and it's someone who has essentially remained loyal to him. So I think it leaves us with the Mandoverse shows, it leaves us Rebels, Clone Wars Season 7, Andor and Rogue One as the remaining projects, losing the sequels Kenobi and Solo. So do I think that George would take back Lucasfilm? Before I wasn't convinced, however, after hearing an interview with George Lucas where he acknowledged the possibility of getting someone else to run the productions before he sold it, this could be an avenue that he might want to explore once more if he did buy it back. At least then he would have the power to choose who does what and step in if things were going horribly wrong, which as of now he doesn't have. And taking into consideration his reasons for retiring, because he wanted to spend more time with his family, and he wanted to do things outside of movie making, well, the museum is now moving into its final stages, and his daughter's now around 10 years old, and likely in education, so he might be finding himself with a little bit extra time. But if he buys it back or not, I think George will be felt in certain stories going forwards, like the Ahsoka movie, Dave Filoni's Heir to the Empire-esque kind of movie, and really any project that Dave plays a part in, and anyone else that comes in that really understands the vision that George Lucas had. Guys, let me know in the comments, do you think George would realistically buy back Lucasfilm? Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new and leave a like on the video, I'd greatly appreciate it. Catch you in the next one, may the Force be with you.